Record. So welcome everyone. I'm Beck from the City of Stonnington, and I'd like to start tonight off with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting tonight, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as extending that respect to any Indigenous people who might be joining us tonight. We acknowledge the living connection to country, the relationship with the land and all living things extending back thousands of years with all Indigenous people. Thank you all for participating in tonight's webinar on composting as a part of the My Smart Garden program. It's a collaborative program between 8 Melbourne Metro councils, and it aims to help residents grow their own food, increase resilience in a changing climate, reduce water waste and water use. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you could please mute yourself, which I think it looks like everyone already has, so well done. Feel free to enter any questions or comments into the chat box, and Kat and I will get to them sort of throughout the sessions or at the end. And yeah, just that we're recording the presentation tonight, so we'll be able to watch it back later on. Now, you might already know Kat. I'd like to introduce her as our presenter for tonight's session. Kat's a passionate gardener with a background in permaculture design. She's written numerous articles and featured in books and has appeared on TV and radio. So welcome, Kat, over to you.
Thank you so much, Beck. It's lovely to be here, everyone. It's a good night for it, isn't it? It's a bit cold and woolly, chilly, drizzly outside. It's perfect to be indoors, learning something about soil and compost that we can go and apply on a nicer day, hopefully. So welcome. I also want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Elders and people who have looked after the land on which I live and work and play for around 60,000 years, we think. And part of that good land management has been making sure that all the organic matter, all the things that once lived are returned to the soil where they build health and resilience. So we're going to take some inspiration from that tonight and talk about how to do that in our current situation, which involves lots of concrete and bitumen and roads and apartments and balconies, and we're gonna find ways to return organic matter to soil tonight using this technique of composting. So me, I'm a home gardener. I'm a really passionate food producer. I love growing, gardening, producing fresh herbs and veggies and fruits. For me, so there's some different types of people, and you can decide where you fit on the spectrum. There are people who are like, composting, I just love the process, love watching things turn back into a soil amendment. And there are people who love the outcome, which is I love getting incredible healthy produce and lots of it and having a really strong garden. So I don't know if you have got a leaning either way. I am a little bit of both. I think the magic of composting gets me every time, how you can throw in all this horrible stinky stuff and get this magical black gold ash that then turns into gorgeous fruits and vegetables. So I do composting because it feeds me. I get to eat great things. I've also done composting professionally for a project for a local council where I was managing 500,000 compost worms and producing a couple of tons of compost a week on a bobcat. So I've got some good perspective from that experience that's going to inform what I talk to you about tonight. And rather than reading lots and lots of books, my experience is sort of driven by a lot of that practical experience. So I've got some goals for tonight's session. I would really like you to have an understanding of the basics, the really important basics of building good compost at home. I'd like you to understand how compost is different to some other ways of composting, different composting systems like worm farms and bokashi and so on. So why would you choose composting over, say, a worm farm or not? I also would like you to understand a little bit more about the why, because that can unpack a bit of why you sometimes get conflicting advice, say, on what can and can't be composted. So just understanding a little bit of the technical background is quite helpful. And of course, I want you to feel confident to start. So that's my goal for tonight's session. I hope that sounds good. Questions tonight, I'm going to try and deal with them as we go because I think that's most helpful for you. But I will stay at the end if there's anything that you'd like to follow up, and we can have a bit of a chat and discussion as well. I'm going to try to assume no prior knowledge. So if I mention a term or something that's not very clear to you, please pull me up on it in the chat window, and that will be very helpful, certainly for more than one person in the meeting tonight. So do feel free to let me know if I accidentally use some jargon or something that's not familiar to you. But while assuming no prior knowledge, I also want to respect the experience that many of you have. There's always a few very experienced gardeners that join these sessions. So if you disagree with something I'm saying, feel free to tell us in the chat window. That's really useful for me. Feel free to give us your tips and insights and tell us how you do things at home as well. That all leads to a really rich, great session for everybody. All right, so enough of that introduction. I'm going to start with showing you a few slides and photographs as well, more importantly. And we're going to start by just defining what is this stuff called compost and what can it do. And I'm going to start with an observation. There's a lot of things that get sold as compost and called compost that as a gardener with maybe a little bit of technical background, I would not refer to as compost. So for me, compost is organic matter. I realise that's jargon. Organic matter is stuff that has lived before, leaves and dead animals, things like paper that used to be a tree. All of that is organic matter. So compost is organic matter that has been decomposed and it's been concentrated. It tends to reduce in volume, and it's been stabilised. So it doesn't get any more reduced or concentrated. This is its sort of final form before it then gets taken up by a plant and hopefully used again. So that's compost. When you buy a bag that says compost from a hardware store sometimes, and it's got bits of pine bark in it that you can recognise, that's not fully composted. It might have some partial compost, but it's not completely composted. There are some machines now that can be very large or on a home scale that will basically chop up and dehydrate your food waste, and they call it compost, and it says it happens in 24 hours. This process can't be rushed. So anything that says it can be compost in 24 hours is a little bit suspect. And really what it is chopped up, dehydrated food waste. Whereas compost is what would happen if we allowed that to be rehydrated and gave it time and then allowed it to break down properly. So it looks like dark chocolate crumbly cake. This stuff here in my hands. And this, I'm going to fess up, this is actually a worm farm, but I could use it as a compost bin, just slightly different way of using it. And the end product is the same. So, you know, plus or minus maybe a few different types of microorganisms, what you get from a worm farm will be pretty much the same as what you get from a compost bin, for example. They're not two separate things. It's all stabilised, decomposed, concentrated organic matter. So what can it do? Well, firstly, just the big picture stuff. When you compost at home, you are reducing greenhouse gas emissions because if we just put organic waste, I shouldn't call it organic waste, or any organic matter that goes into landfill is creating methane, which is a much, much more serious and damaging greenhouse gas emission than carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is what is released as a compost is breaking down. So that's worst case scenario of it going into landfill. And happily, luckily, now there's a lot of councils that are allowing you to put even food scraps in a green waste bin. But they're still going on a truck and they're still going a very long way out of town, and then they have to be moved around to use that product. So by composting at home, you're actually really cutting out that whole chain, and you're doing the most sensitive thing environmentally that we know how to do. And by returning it eventually to soil, you are playing a very significant role in helping to restore soil health. And that's just not just for the sake of the soil. There's a lot of very useful jobs for us as gardeners that restoring soil health through compost contributes to. So, for example, when we add compost, we're adding back that organic matter and we're adding nutrients, and that's what plants need to grow. So if you want growing healthy, strong plants, you need to be cycling this organic matter around and around. Compost actually also builds better soil structure. So that's say the difference between if you've got sandy soil, having a soil that you can almost tip between your fingers like a sandpit, that's not good structure. Or if you're in a clay area and you can pick up a whole block of soil and it's one solid mass, that's also not good soil structure. What compost will do for both types of soil is make them crumbly and make them loose and make them open. It does that through bacteria and fungi actually that create these little crumbs in the soil. And that's fantastic because a crumbly soil lets in the roots and it lets in the water and it lets in the air, the oxygen and other gases. And all of that leads to more resilient plants. And also significantly, compost and organic matter hold water. And for soils that are at risk of getting very dry at times in summer, it's like adding sponges to your soil that can actually hang on to that water when it comes and release it when it's needed. And quite topical at the moment with all the flooding that's been happening, we're actually also, by creating healthy soil, minimising some of the risk of flash flooding that can happen in a heavy rain event. Because by holding water where it falls in your garden, it's not running down stormwater drains and leading to flooding lower down in the landscape. Compost also is quite magically able to balance a soil, whether it's acid or alkaline. So whatever end of the pH spectrum your soil is on, or whatever side I should say, hopefully it's not an end, whatever side it's on, adding compost will bring it slightly back towards the neutral range, which is where most of our, particularly our food plants, like to reside. So very helpful. We're also boosting soil microorganisms. And these days, many people are familiar with our microbiome in our gush. And we know the importance of having the right mix of little microbes that help us digest our food and do lots of other jobs in our bodies. And it's actually just the same in the soil. The soil has a microbiome, and compost is adding the right type of microbes that will also contribute to stronger, healthier plants as well. And there's probably many other things, but the last one tonight on my list is that by adding compost, you are actually able to kind of lock up heavy metals that might be in your soil. I'm mostly talking about things like lead here. So it can't get rid of them, but it can make them less available for plants to take into their tissue. And compost, believe it or not, it's also been shown to break down some serious contaminants like petrol, the things that can be kind of deconstructed into simpler, less harmful compounds. And compost and really the microbes in compost are what can do that sort of work. So pretty substantial list of things. And I guess in a nutshell, like adding compost sorts out so many different garden problems. And if you get on the front foot and you apply compost straight up without getting to those problems, you're building resilience into your food growing system. So my message is, if you can make good compost, you can grow great produce. And I say that again and again and again. So this is probably the #1 skill that I would hope that anyone wanting to learn how to grow great food would try and really nail. So thank you for being here tonight, and I hope you're excited about that as maybe your end goal, if not the means or the excitement of the journey. Just remember, you can put questions or comments and things in at any point into that chat window as we go. That's great for me, so I can have a little break as well. Okay, so now, which compost system is right for you? So to find what compost is, there's a lot of different ways of getting that black, dark, crumbly chocolate cake. So we've got to think about which one suits our setup the best. And I'm only going to talk about sort of traditional composting tonight, but I just want you to have a sense for what some other types of compost system might be like and whether they actually might be more relevant for you. So firstly, worm farms, really popular. They also, in my experience, have a very high failure rate because keeping worms is like having an extra pet. And unfortunately, they don't often get prioritised when they need it most. So unfortunately, when I see them working really well is when people are really into them. And that can mean they've got little people, kids in their house who are really excited about having a worm farm, and that draws everyone's attention back to it and it gets managed really well. It's best if you've got somewhere that you can use the worm castings, although I suppose you could always give them away and that would be very welcome for gardeners like me. But it's nice to have somewhere to actually get the benefit of the effort that you put in. It's best if you've only got really small amounts of food waste, because even in a small household like mine, I find I need more than one worm farm to actually process even a very efficient minimal waste kitchen. If you go away on long summer holidays regularly, that's a problem because the worms' most dangerous time of year is in summer. And if the bedding, the stuff that they're living in gets over 35 degrees, then they die. So, you know, we get quite hot, a lot hotter than that in Melbourne. So it doesn't take much to really, really stress them out in summer. And unfortunately, once your worm farm has died, there's quite a slow startup journey. It can take sort of 6 months to get it back to a point where it's processing a lot of food waste for you. So that's a warts and all honest assessment of where worm farms sit for me. But if you are really engaged and you've got the right spot for them and you commit to taking care of them, worm farms are very, very good. Compost bins, what we're talking about tonight, just normal composting. It's really good for households that have a garden or pot plants to use the compost. You're going to need some sort of source of carbon materials. We're going to talk a lot more about what they are later. So you need to have them and put the effort into getting them. It's okay if you take long summer holidays because the compost can stop and start. And it's okay if you have quite a large amount of food scraps, or if you have a variable quantity. You might have, you know, a few buckets one week and nothing the next week. And both of those last things, again, they're a bit tricky if you've got a worm farm because they need small and they need consistent volumes of food waste. Bokashi, I'm not going to go into what it is, sorry, for time reasons, but it's sort of a fermenting system that can hold your food scraps in a kind of a nice state until they can be buried or composted somewhere else. You might like to look it up. So these are good for households that are not willing or they're not able to manage something like a compost or a worm farm. It might be because they're too busy, it might be because there's lots of people coming and going and nobody sort of stays there long enough to learn what to do. They're really good in offices and they can accept almost all types of food scraps. So they're very flexible in terms of what you can put in them, and that makes it good if you can't teach everybody yes to this and no to that. There's a small ongoing cost, about 50 cents a week, to buy the Bokashi inoculant that you sprinkle on top to help it ferment properly. You also have to like the smell of pickles, being fully honest, and some people do and some people don't. And you are going to end up with a bucket that's quite heavy that you'll need to either bury the contents of or take it somewhere it can be composted. So I've got friends that live in apartments and they just dig a hole somewhere in the landscaping once every couple of weeks and bury their Bokashi. I know other people who will take it to a friend or to a community garden and then have it composted there. So that's Bokashi. Then we've got curbside collection. So this is putting food waste in your green bin and of course other garden waste and grass clippings as well. And if your household isn't particularly engaged, not excited about composting or growing food, that can be the best option. If you've got very large quantities of food scraps and you just wouldn't have space to deal with them. And of course, you've got to live in a council that has a green waste service. And if you want to put food in, you've got to have one that lets you put food in garden organics, which is that FOGO term. And many councils also charge you a fee. So again, it's got a cost attached that you need to be okay with. And I'm also going to mention Share Waste here. And this is a little website where you can get connected to a household that is willing to accept your food and garden waste. So if you're environmentally minded, which motivates you to put in a bit of effort, if you don't have a garden or pot plants, to use compost, if you're willing to regularly have a walk with your scrap bucket, if you enjoy interacting with other people, then Share Waste could be the right system for you. So having gone through that, I'm curious. I wonder if anyone wants to tell us in the chat window which one is best for them, or confirm for us that composting is the right system for them. I'd love to know where you sit and if there's anything that's come out of that. While you think about that, I also thought I'd show you this comparison as well. We're going to talk about what goes in compost later in more detail, but this for me is quite interesting. What can you put in each system? And it's not to say that some of these crosses, I mean, you can get away with a little bit of citrus in a worm farm, you can get away with a little bit of meat in a compost bin, but you can't do a lot or you start to get issues. So this is interesting for me because you can sort of see just how flexible composting is and how inflexible worm farming can be. There's a lot that can't go in a worm farm if you want to keep your worms really happy and humming along. Also bokashi, and also putting food and garden organics in a green bin, of course, very, very flexible as well. Beck is saying she's kept a regular compost bin after a failed worm farm, and she doesn't have the time to put into it that it needs. And she's also got a Share Waste drop-off point. So thanks, Beck. Yeah, it's a good example. Okay, the other thing that we're going to need just before we get to the composting is you're probably going to want a scrap bucket. And I'm assuming that most of you are going to want to compost your food scraps, as that is a very rich source of nutrient. It's also something that we want to try and keep out of landfill and put to use. So if this is you, you're going to need some kind of a scrap bucket in your kitchen where it's convenient. You're probably going to want what we call a caddy. Now, a lot of councils are giving away ones like the one on the left here, and I'm guessing that would be maybe a 5-litre caddy as a guess. My experience with that as a small household is that by the time I have filled that up, being fairly efficient in the kitchen, there's not a lot that goes in. And if I were to wait for that to fill up, that would be maybe a week, and it would absolutely stink. It would have little vinegar flies around it. Basically, I'm going to be very much procrastinating emptying it because I know how gross it's going to be. So just a little message here on scale, and for the size of your house and for the amount of food scraps and things that you're producing, make sure you've got the right size container so that it only sits there for about 2 or 3 days maximum. So for me, that's a 2-litre container, and that's right for my scale. All right, now we're choosing a compost bin. I'd love to know if you've already got one, tell us what you've got. We've got these sort of normal bins like this. Lots of times they've got sort of air holes for aeration in the sides, which can be quite good. And some of them have got a little trapdoor down the bottom, which can also be good if you can get it open and back on again, which is a bit challenging sometimes. But that's sometimes handy to scrape out some finished compost without moving the whole bin. They range and they get really expensive, some of them. This is an aero bin. It's probably the most expensive compost bin you can buy at home. It's insulated, which will be of note when we talk about hot composting later on. It has a bigger trapdoor that I have never successfully been able to put back on once I've used it. It's got a sort of catchment down the bottom so that you can have it on concrete, and any liquid that comes out of the compost bin gets contained, although you have to try and do something with it or it stinks. Yep, that's an aero bin system. We decorated it. They don't come looking that cool. Then we've got, well, this is actually one of mine, and I am using it as a worm farm, but it would equally work as a compost bin. And this you might recognise as just a salvaged 60-litre garbage bin that I have drilled some holes in, and it's got some drainage holes around the base as well. This is a good deal more rodent proof than most of the composting systems that are on the market. So if you know that's an issue, you might want to consider just drilling a few holes in a garbage bin and using that. If they're very keen, rodents will chew through plastic, but they haven't so far here. And rodent control is a sort of key concern when you're composting in urban areas. So that works just beautifully. Yeah, and better than, as I said, better than a lot of composting systems that I've played with. In larger gardens and also many community gardens, they have these bay setups, and the idea is that these rungs in between them are removable, so you can in theory flip the compost from one into the next to turn it. We're going to talk about some alternatives to turning because it's such high effort, but it's a nice community activity. And when you've got a working bee, there's lots of people there enjoying themselves, wanting to warm up their muscles. It can be really nice. So yeah, the bay systems are designed to allow you to kind of do batches and turn them over, and also look like you know what you're doing, which is important in community gardens. If you've got a bit of a slope, I just wanted to show you my friend Joel Meadows, the alternative technology legend in Castlemaine. He has used his slope to great effect and has built his bay system so that the corrugated iron here and here slides out and here. And he can use gravity to do a lot of that turning work rather than human muscle and backbreaking labour. So that's a really nice little retrofit if you do have any slope where you live. Isabel's saying she loves composting and has 3 220 litre tumbleweed bins and also a worm cafe, which is a brand name worm farm. That's great, Isabel. So many different types of compost bin. They all work in the same way, and we'll talk now about some of the pros and cons and why they work and so on. So you might need to play around a bit to find one that suits you. Oh, actually, before we do that, I'm going to show you another one which will be relevant for many of you that have smaller gardens. And I'm going to, before I actually show you the system, let me show you the garden, and because it's so inspiring, and it'll show you the sort of context that this system can fit in. So this is my friend Danny's garden. It's called Sky Garden, and it's on the 11th story of an apartment block in South Yarra. Okay, so I'm not talking over the video because the quality can get interrupted. But that's Sky Garden. And when this video was taken, it was only 3 months old. And it's made from almost entirely scrap materials except for the potting mix itself. So these are wooden pallets. These are 20-litre food grade buckets that lots of hospitality businesses like cafes and restaurants go through and chuck out. There's a bit of 90mm PVC pipe here that's been scavenged for some really small pots. And the compost is actually this bucket under here. And all of this, the whole balcony is about 4 square metres. So it really is pretty mind-blowing how much is fitting in there. And it got significantly more lush afterwards, after 3 months, but I don't have another video in here to show you yet. So this composting system, 11 stories up, on this apartment balcony. It's an extremely waste efficient kitchen. So the compost is also including things that other people are trying to recycle, including whole zucchinis, apparently. Weird things people are putting in the recycling chute. And so the compost is actually taking from other balconies, which is pretty cool. And this is what the compost looks like in that bucket. Yeah, so it's pretty lush looking compost. And there are worms in there that have been added, just in case you were wondering. But yeah, that is some of the finest compost that I've ever seen. So we're going to talk about how that's possible in a bucket. I'm just noting in the chat, a few of you have got Tumbleweed brand compost systems. And Isabel's got a maize caddy and is using recyclable bags to keep down the smell. So that's interesting. Great, so we are talking about the portable bucket composting system, and there's a lot of text here, so it's really here if you want to kind of come back to the recording and freeze it and get detailed instructions. But basically you salvage these buckets from your local pub or restaurant. You're going to drill some holes in the top of them. You're going to drill at least one hole in the bottom and some around the very base to make sure that there's some drainage. On that note, it is potentially going to leak a little bit of what we call leachate out. So if that's a problem for you with staining tiles or anything like that, you'll need to keep it in some kind of tray. And the holes are sort of 3 and 5 mil, which are sized hopefully to keep most flies out, and also critically rodents as well. And what you're going to do is also have a bucket of something that's like a bit of soil and sawdust mixed together. You probably can get away with just the sawdust. So you'll need some of that on hand. And every time you add food scraps, you're going to just sprinkle them with a small layer of some of the sawdust and soil or compost if you've got it as well. And then when the bucket is full, you're going to make sure you check the moisture. We'll talk about moisture later. So when it's full, you need to put the lid on tight and either shake it if you've got a really good lid and you're strong, or if that's not true, then you can use a compost screw that I'll show you a photo of later and just fluff it up every few weeks. And this system will give you some finished compost in about 3 to 6 months. This system's been well tried and tested now by friends of mine, Steve and Rabea, and also Danny, and it works just beautifully. And I guess the nice thing about it is you can scale as many buckets as you like, and you can pick them up and move them when you move house if you're a renter, and they fit really nicely, even stacked if you must, in a small space as well. So this is a brilliant option, I think, for people in really small units and balconies and rentals. All right, let's move on. We're going to talk about setting up the compost now. Sorry, I haven't taken a photo for this slide yet. The things that I'm mostly thinking about when I site a compost are, I want it to be as close to the kitchen as possible and really easy to access. So if you stick it down the back of the garden, you've got stuff piled around it, it's hard to get to, you might be tempted not to use it or delay emptying your kitchen scrap bucket, which leads to stinkiness and all bad things. So try and keep it really convenient and close to the kitchen. Happily, you don't have to worry whether it's in sun or shade, which is another nice thing about a compost bin as opposed to a worm farm. So it can be in either. It does work a little bit more efficiently if it's protected from the real baking summer heat and if it has a little bit of sun in winter to speed things up. So if you have the best of both worlds, maybe a summer and a winter compost bin, or if you've got a deciduous tree that will drop its leaves in winter, that is actually ideal. But if you've just got shade, it's a really good thing to do in shade where it's more difficult to find plants that will grow. It's nice to put it next to a tree so that if you do have anything nutrient rich leaching out, the tree can of course soak that up and benefit. So that's something worth thinking about if it's relevant. And really the most important thing, which is not related to the location, is wherever you decide to put your compost, I want you to make sure that you've got a stash of carbon materials sitting right next to it where they're really convenient to add. I'm going to talk about what those are next, but just remember that that is key. You've got your compost system, and you've got your carbon materials, and they're not separate. They need to be together so that they get used correctly. And also when you're setting up your compost, when you install your bin, whatever system you end up using, and even if you just have a pile on the ground, which you can do, you don't actually technically need any bin around it, you're always going to start with your layer of carbon materials just to soak up anything that might drip out of the pile. And Isabel's saying she's adopted her local, it's a local bakery, and they collect their coffee grounds on a regular basis. That's awesome. Yeah, if you want to fast track your compost and start building more and more of it, it's a really nice thing to do, is adopt a local hospitality business. All right, so now let's move into what can be composted, and I'm hoping that you'll have a crack here and let me know what you think. These are all the materials I took to a recent face-to-face workshop, and we're going to go through them one by one now and talk about them. So firstly, kitchen scrap bucket. That's a yes. I won't even ask you that one because it's obvious. That's a really nice one to start with. What about leaves? Tell me about leaves. Do they go in? You just put a yes or a no or a Y or an N in the chat window, and any qualifications you might like to make. So Simone and Kavitha are going yes, and I absolutely agree. And these leaves are comfrey leaves, for the people who know what comfrey is. I'm just popping that in the chat window. Comfrey leaves in particular are a really, really nutrient-rich addition to your compost bin. And they're so rich in nitrogen that people say they can replace an animal manure in your compost. So they're that chock full of nutrient. So if I had lots and lots of space, I'd probably have heaps of comfrey, and I'd just be throwing it around everywhere. It's got these lovely deep roots that go down several feet, and they draw any nutrients that have been leached down into the subsoil back to the surface. So yeah, really functional, useful plant to have, although they do spread very easily if you have any chopped bits of root. So just be careful with that. They will all become new plants. Okay, what about these leaves? Would you stick them in compost? Yeah, it's not a trick question, and Simone's got it yes, but chopped up. And yep, people are saying yes. So the leaves, no worries at all. When we've got branches like this, the answer is, well, it depends. These little side shoots here that are a bit yellow, they're probably fine in compost. They are probably going to break down okay. These slightly larger stems here, that's last year's growth, that is not going to break down in the lifetime of a home compost. And it doesn't matter, but they can be just really irritating if you're trying to shovel or fork out compost. So they're a no for me, and I will just hack them up a bit and chuck them under a fruit tree as mulch, or use them in the garden as a stake or something like that. What about these leaves here? These are from pumpkin and zucchini. Simone's saying yes. I know they're all leaves, aren't they? Walter's saying no. I'm interested in why you're saying no, Walter. Radika's saying yes. And Michael's saying yes, if not diseased. And Beck's pointing out, yes, this one does have what we call powdery mildew, which is what Walter was picking up on. So this powdery mildew here is a fungal disease. It's incredibly common. It's pretty much the natural end of life companion for anything in this family, the cucurbit family, which includes pumpkin, zucchini, cucumbers, etc. And this is an area of dispute, because people say that if you've got something that is diseased, then if you put it in the compost, then it can come back and infect the crops next year. And there could well be truth to that. I'm going to say, in my own personal experience, I have been chopping these up and using them back as mulch on the beds. And I've been doing that for around 8 or 9 years now, and I'm yet to see the problem exacerbate or exponentially get worse every year. So I compost these, no worries. And that's really your choice whether or not you agree with me or not. I'll just tell you what I do. There may be some other diseases that are more serious, and yeah, you might want to think twice about composting them. So do a bit of research. Powdery mildew is not one that I'm afraid of sticking in my compost personally. And Michael has pointed out that you could put it in a hot compost, and we're going to talk about exactly what that is later. And that is very true, even if it's diseased, shouldn't be an issue. There's little qualification that I'll leave until later. And let me see. Yeah, people talking about some tomato diseases. Yeah, so yeah, there might be some diseases where it's a bad idea, but powdery mildew, which is one of the most common ones that crops up, I'm not as worried about. There's some great tips going in the chat window about managing powdery mildew as well, which I really appreciate. Okay, next plant. What's going on here? Are these a yes or a no or a maybe? And while you're considering that, on the left we've got this is some very rhizomatous grass. It's got these long spreading horizontal stems. This is something like a cooch or a kikuyu, which is really common in many Australian lawns. And over here we've got, have I picked up here? Let me just have a look. It's in the same family as lettuce, so it's a wild weedy relative. And these are, yes, generating a solid list of maybes in the chat window. So the key things here are that with this grass here, if it's still alive, and it does look dead, but sometimes it's a bit hard to tell and it can rebirth itself like a zombie. With this type of grass, any of these little nodes here, the little bumps on the stem, can regrow if it's not completely dead. And this stuff is a nightmare in a food garden. It's awesome in a drought tolerant lawn, and it's terrible if you're trying to grow veggies. So that one is like I'm a bit nervous because it might not be fully dead. I'd also be a little bit nervous in a hot compost because it's difficult to guarantee that everything is going to get hot enough to kill it around the outside, say, for example. And over here, these are all seed heads here. So they're all hundreds and hundreds of new weedy plants ready to get started. And I might, if I stuck it in the compost, I might accidentally give them the most perfect start they could imagine with all the beautiful moisture holding, fertile, rich compost goodness. So yes, if I could guarantee that that they were going to get cooked in a hot compost, that'd be all right. Otherwise, I might think twice. So maybe it's probably the right answer there. All right, here we've got a selection of cardboard and printer paper, newspapers, magazines. Tell me about these. What's your vibe with all the paper and cardboard? And I'm seeing a yep from Simone and from Walter. Big yes from Michael and Kavitha as well. And yeah, look, generally this is yes. There's a few things I do want to point out to you. One of them is it's a bit out of frame in the photo, but these are sort of glossy magazines up here, and I would avoid them because I'm less sure about what they've put in those inks, and sometimes the glossy magazines don't break down very well and they can have some other stuff in them that's not something I'd want to end up eating. And also, just where there's a lot of ink, like this piece of cardboard here that's mostly black, I might give that a miss. Now I've tried so many times to phone up the companies that make ink and toner and ask them what they actually stick in their products, but nobody will get back to you. I feel pretty comfortable with all the major Australian newspapers, and they're using vegetable-based inks. I've had one terrible experience with a small circulation newspaper that did not break down after 12 months inside a worm farm, which is outrageous for anyone who has tried worm farming. That they love newspaper, and it tends to be one of the quick things to decompose. So that obviously had some sort of treatment on it that was very, very bad. And I thanked the worms for letting me know about that and not eating it. And so I tend to stick to the major newspapers now in Australia, unfortunately. And there's a comment on tea bags here, having stuff in them that you don't want. And I actually haven't got a photo of a tea bag yet, but what we've learned, certainly myself in recent years, is that even if a tea bag looks like paper, it likely has plastic in the weave, and that's to stop it from sort of falling apart when you try and squeeze your tea bag and get all the nice flavour out of it. So unfortunately, most tea bags are a no unless they say specifically otherwise. And there are some that are just completely made of plastic now, which is very depressing. And there's a comment here on rhubarb leaves. So I wouldn't worry about them at all. I wouldn't eat a lot of them, but there's no problem putting them in your compost. All right, next up we've got some woody things. Tell me about those. Oh yeah, and Michael's saying 5 years later, tea bags still turning up in the garden empty. So all of the organic matter components of the tea bag have broken down. So all the contents and all of the paper in the bag, but you'll often see like a skeleton of the tea bag, which is the sort of I guess it's the nylon or the sort of plastic weave component that hasn't broken down. Yep, that's it, Michael. So what do you reckon around these woody things? Yeah, getting lots of no's. So there's a couple of reasons why it might be a no. Firstly, on the left here is a bit of a strange example, but I just grabbed a stick that I've used to stir some paint to represent. You don't want any painted, treated, varnished, or fumigated timbers. So of course we don't want any of the old CCA timber, copper, chromium, arsenate timber, and that includes wood shavings, of course, or anything else made from that. Yet the paint we don't want to end up eating, we don't want that through our soil. So any timber that's a bit suspect in that respect, forget it. This is, obviously it's also getting a bit too big to get broken down, so that's a no on that ground. I wanted to show you though, this palette here, this HT stamp means it's just heat treated. So that's actually fine. But of course it's a bit chunky, so we're probably still not going to put it in. But I just wanted to talk about like a safe timber treatment versus some of those chemical treatments that we don't want to put in. Yep, so Michael's on the money here. Woody things need to be sure they're not treated and also need to be kind of broken up a bit. So it's exactly right. Yep. So what can we use? We can use wood shavings as long as we know that they are clean in the sense of not having been from anything treated, painted, varnished. These are sensational. I wish I could say go here and this is where you'll find your wood shavings, but unfortunately there's no kind of big source of them that we can all access. So it is a bit of a question of asking around, maybe like having a look around your local industrial estate and seeing if there's any businesses that make things out of clean timber. I get these from a guy who makes toys out of them. It's a little small business, and it's all fresh timber. These are really, really valuable in compost because they're very rich in carbon and you don't need very much of them to balance all the other nitrogen-rich things like your food scraps that are going in. So they're quite high value, and they're also very fluffy because they just the structure of them. So they're adding air to the pile as well, which minimises the amount of turning and fluffing that you'll need to do. So really, really, really good if you can find a source. Straw, I won't ask you that one because that's obvious. Yes, you can put straw in compost. It's a bit of a classic. But I'm going to say one thing about straw is that it's usually trucked in, which is not ideal because it uses petrol. And unless you know it's come from an organically managed property, you can have residues of pesticides, herbicides and that sort of thing in there. There's been a case recently where some pretty terrible herbicide got into, I think it was compost or maybe no soil mix, I think, that what came kind of through composting into soil mix, and then ruined a whole lot of people's gardens across Melbourne because even very trace quantities were toxic for some types of plants. So it's something I do have a bit more of an eye on now. So most likely you're going to be fine. But if you are buying stuff, just know that can be a problem. What I prefer to gather instead, if I don't have enough wood shavings, are these autumn leaves. So these are from the deciduous street trees, and these ones specifically are from plane trees, Plane, plane trees, which line a lot of streets in many parts of Melbourne, and which get swept up and taken away by council. And Michael's putting a vote in for pin oak leaves. So oak leaves are fantastic as well, elm leaves. They're all really good. I like these ones because they're a few streets away from me. They drop en masse, they break down beautifully, and they're also, because they're very broad, very good at covering up whatever I've put underneath them. So they're very good at preventing smells and things like that. These are just the easiest ones for me to get, but I strongly support oak leaves, pin oak leaves, all the deciduous leaves that you can access. And these are, arguably my most sustainable source of carbon materials. They're local, they're free, they're unpackaged, they haven't travelled a long way in a car or a vehicle. So these are gold for me. And don't believe anyone who says they won't break down. They will break down for you as mulch, or they will break down in a compost heap as long as they've got enough moisture. All right, what we've got here, we've got a biodegradable bag. Is that going in compost? Yes, no, or maybe. Yeah, Simone's not sure. Walter and Kavita are saying no. Yeah, this is a bit of a confusing one. And Michael's saying yes, the neighbours will even give you a beer for raking up their leaves. Well, beer's pretty good, Michael, but I have had people come and help me rake up leaves and take them away, which was really nice. A few of you saying no to this biodegradable bag. So the issue here is, yes, it may eventually biodegrade, but what conditions are required for that to happen? Most likely in a home compost system, unless it specifically says home compostable, which is a new standard that we've got. If it says home compostable, sure, but otherwise it's likely to be hanging around for maybe a year or sometimes longer before it will actually break down, looking a bit gross in the meantime. So it's not going to do damage, but it's not ideal. So it will break down in a hot compost. Again, we'll talk about that in a sec. But unfortunately, even like in the commercial composts that councils run, they often don't let you put these in because it stuffs up other machinery that they use for sifting and sorting and so on. So this is a bit of a question mark, and before you invest in a stash of these, it's really worth just experimenting a bit and checking that it is okay and they are all right to put in your home compost. Yeah, that's people saying in the chat they do take a really long time to break down. So yeah, just bear in mind that, but it also won't do any damage. It's just more of an annoying thing and an aesthetic thing. Yeah, so some people have been given these by councils, and some councils say no, you can't put them in. So unfortunately, it depends which area you're in and who's servicing that council network. Now, inside this bag, there's some litter from a rabbit pen. So that's a definite yes. So we'll just mention that one. And moving along, this one's interesting. This is litter that I have dug out from my aviary at home where I keep quail. It could also be chickens for the sake of talking about compost. So that's a definite yes. But interestingly here, I've got a mix. So I put some leaves and I put some little wood shavings and things as a base in the aviary. And what's happened is this is actually composting all on its own, just with a little bit of moisture and a little bit of me fluffing and turning it over. So this lovely chocolate colour that's developing is actually because I've balanced the chook or the quail manure with the bedding, and I can actually scoop this out and just use it straight in my veggie bed as compost. So that's pretty magical. I don't have to ever muck out a stinking chook run. But yeah, poultry manure, fantastic, and again, very rich. So that little game's over. Thanks for indulging me. What we want to talk about now is actually how to build compost and how to get the balance right. So the very basics of it are that we want to build the compost a bit like a lasagna with layers. And generally speaking, the layers seem to work best when they're about 10 centimetres thick or a bit less. And generally, whenever we put something that's rich in nitrogen, which we'll talk about in a sec, we cover with carbon-rich materials. So we try and get a bit of a balance of both of them. And we always end with the carbon on top because that is what suppresses smell. So try it for an equal volume, but they're not all the same. So here's a bit of a chart for you to see where things lie. And you'll notice that I've got some extremely rich carbon over here, and I've got some extremely rich nitrogen over here. So if you're working with anything from those columns, the layers need to be a lot thinner, like around an inch or 3 centimetres, so as not to sort of overwhelm or overbalance. So we could add, say, our grass clippings at 10 centimetre layer, and we might cover them with a 3 centimetre layer of sawdust or wood shavings, for example. So this is rule of thumb stuff. In practice, you just try it and then you look and see what happens and you adjust it if necessary. So unless you build exactly the same compost heaps all the time, you'll always just be sort of tinkering a little bit to try and make sure that the balance is right. So yeah, just have a look, and I put some photos up that roughly align with where they sit on this spectrum. And at this stage, many people will have heard greens and browns to refer to greens being nitrogen and browns being carbon. So you can think about it in those terms if you like, but there are some notable exceptions, like poultry manure is brown in colour, but it's very much at the extreme nitrogen end of the spectrum, so it can trip you up. The way that I like to think about these two balances is if you could leave it sitting in a pile for a really long time, then it's rich in carbon. If a big pile of it would start to stink, then it's rich in nitrogen. That rule won't let you down. Things need to have some nitrogen in them to really start to get funky. So that's the way I tend to think about it if I'm unsure about something. And of course, there are things which are a bit more balanced and are in the middle. All right, so I've mentioned it a few times now. Let's talk about hot and cold compost, because this is the source of a lot of confusion around what you can and what you can't put in a compost heap. So a hot compost is a really big, well-built pile that is able to build up a lot of heat. And that heat, by the way, that is microbes breeding like crazy and just being so active that they generate all that heat. So hot compost can get up to 65 degrees, actually can get up to about 80, but we don't really want it that hot because we start to kill off the things that we're trying to create, all the good microorganisms. So here's some examples for you. This is me making compost on a bobcat, and I'm not making a pile, I'm actually making a windrow, which is a giant long pile, a row of it. And if you look closely, you'll kind of see steam coming off the bucket of the bobcat here. So it's getting very, very hot. This is when I worked down at the Collingwood Children's Farm, and I could throw in entire, like, whole waxed cardboard boxes and they were gone in 2 weeks. Amazing. And people talk about being able to put, roadkill in the centre of these hot compost piles, and it's gone in 3 weeks. So they're enormously powerful digestive creations. Over here is, this is a very big compost. It's about 2 meters high and wide. And this, just to sort of tell the story of the awesome power of compost, this has got a coil inside it, a copper coil, And this compost is actually heating water for the 2 shower blocks on the hill behind it. So this is at a permaculture design course at Yandoit Farm. We have compost showers, compost powered showers on the course, which is really living the dream. And this is the thermometer that just is checking how hot the pile is. And those of you who know a thing or two about hot water services will know that the magic temperature is 60 degrees. And above that, you're safe from things like Legionnaires. So that's why you always try and keep your hot water service around 60. So you can see we're definitely meeting the mark with the hot compost pile here. So I hope you enjoy that. So look, if you want to make hot compost, the things that you'll need to make it happen are at least a cubic metre of material. And that's just so that the heat that is generated naturally through the microbes being active can get trapped in the pile. It's a really small pile, it just won't build up. So it needs a cubic metre volume, or sometimes you can do smaller if you insulate the pile, which is what some of those compost bins do. They have insulated layers, so you can kind of cheat a bit. And critically here, it needs to all be stacked in there at once. So you don't build up slowly to a cubic metre volume like a lot of the bay systems that I showed you earlier. You actually need to have it all ready to go at once. And of course, you need to be really clever and have a real feel for the right balance of carbon and nitrogen and air and water. It's just a lot more work to adjust it if you get it wrong. So what that means is that most people, most of the time when they do composting, are not doing technically they're not doing a hot compost. You might have a warm compost, but it's unlikely that you'll be reaching this sort of 65-degree mark. And that's totally okay, but it means that you're probably not going to destroy pathogens and weed seeds in a home garden context. And even when you do make a big pile like this, in order for all of it to be treated, if the goal is to destroy pathogens and weed seeds, you have to be quite careful when you turn it. You have to turn it for one. You have to try and get the outside into the centre and the centre into the outside to make sure that all of it is getting processed at that hot temperature. So yeah, it's that's why I'm hesitant to put things with weed seeds and things that might spread even into a hot compost, because I know how difficult it is to make sure that all of it has got to that temperature. But it is fun to give a go. Yeah, if you have all that material at home, it is a fun thing to try. It's just less likely that you'll be doing this as your kind of normal composting method to process food and green waste at home. Okay, so moving on, there's a few things we haven't mentioned yet that are really important. You need to have air in your compost, and you need to have moisture, because the microbes, just like us, need moisture and need air. What you don't need to do is do backbreaking labour of turning a compost heap unless you want to. You're quite welcome to do that. But the easier way to make this happen is get a garden fork or get a screw. And there's not many special tools that I endorse for home gardens, but these compost screws are really good, and they help you to just screw in and then gently pull up and fluff, and that's enough to get that air in there. And if you're patient, then you don't need to do any other kind of turning to make your compost happen. And with moisture, I think I've got it here. The ideal moisture for a compost heap is actually the same as growing vegetables, as a side note. It should be like a damp kitchen sponge that's been wrung out, but you can still touch it and feel a bit of moisture. And that's around 50%. So if you can squeeze a handful of your compost materials and you get a drip of moisture coming out, that's about 50%, and that's perfect. So if you have more than that, then you're actually starting to fill up all the air pockets. And we also need that air, of course. So try to have it a little bit wet, but not soaking wet, is the advice. And yeah, the fluffing can happen every few weeks. It doesn't need to be every day, it doesn't need to be every week, just every 2 or 3 weeks. And if you do notice your compost has started to sort of pack down and look compacted, then definitely give it a bit of a fluff. And Michael's saying he just built his second hot compost last week, and within 4 days it was at 60 degrees. So you built it perfectly, Michael, we can tell from that. And that's a typical time for it to get up to that temperature. So congratulations. All right, so coming towards the end of things I'm going to talk about with you tonight, there's a few troubleshooting tips that are worth knowing when you're getting started. And the most obvious one is, oh my God, my compost stinks, what do I do? So firstly, if it's stinking, just aerate it. And it might not fix the problem straight away, but that could be enough. Because if there's not any oxygen in the pile, we say it's anaerobic. And what we're actually doing then is we're like pickling food waste. We're not actually decomposing food waste. It's a bit like making sauerkraut, but you're making it with really disgusting stuff. So make sure that it's fluffed and it's got oxygen. And whenever you smell something stinky, if you want to cut that stink out, we cover it with a layer of carbon. And it's best to have nice broad carbon, so bits of newspaper, those lovely broad plane tree leaves that I love, anything that is quite good coverage. So putting, for example, handfuls of straw on top it is a carbon material, but it's not going to have the same effect because it's got lots of gaps in between it. So aerate, cover with some carbon. And if the problem was just not enough oxygen, then that might be enough. But often what's happened is you've got a bit too much nitrogen in there. And so even with good oxygen, it's still going to stink a bit. So then we need to try and mix some carbon-rich materials into the pile. And so that's a bit of work, obviously. That's where something really small and concentrated like sawdust or wood shavings is handy. So we just sort of try and fluff and turn and throw some of that in. And usually that will fix that problem. And again, we'll cover it with a fresh layer of carbon on top to make sure it's capped off really well. I've put a note in here. If the pile seems very wet, then often those dry materials like sawdust, newspaper and so on can help to sponge that up, and that can help. You may, if it's just wet, if it's just far too wet, you may throw the balance out again by doing that, but you can always play with it a little bit later. Yes, covering with carbon I've covered, and if I would recommend that you just stop adding anything new to it until you've got it back into balance, to give it a bit of time. So that's for the really stinky compost. If the opposite happens and nothing is happening, it's not breaking down, I check the moisture, of course, and I aerate it. But if it's not warming up at all and it's not starting to break down, then we could actually go, well, maybe there's not enough nitrogen in that pile. And so, of course, you'd try and mix some of those things in. And probably the reason I mentioned urine in the table just before is because it's very easy to pee on a compost pile, and that is a tried and tested way of bringing it back into balance if it needs a little bit of nitrogen added, also if it needs a bit of moisture as well. Cool. Next one is, oh my God, I've got so many vinegar flies everywhere. And these are the little flies that hover around a fruit bowl inside. There's a few species, but they, of course, they can also go for a compost heap, and they're particularly likely to get involved if you're not putting that carbon layer on top and covering things like food scraps properly, and if you've got that balance a little bit out as well. So the root cause solution is getting your compost nice and balanced. But if you're pulling off the lid of your compost and there's like 2,000 flies coming at your face, that's gross. And it's something that we can try and manage with a few traps. So these are the things you can make yourself pretty easily. They seem to really love apple cider vinegar, but you could try any vinegar that you like. I guess the fruit in it is a natural attractant. So I just dilute apple cider vinegar with a bit of water, and you put just a very small amount, 2 or 3 drops of dishwashing liquid in there, or some soap, and swish it in. And the soap or the dishwashing liquid is changing the surface tension. And that means that when they try and land on the surface, they fall in and drown. and there's a few little dead ones in there just to prove the point for you. So you can make quite a lot of these traps, and you can stick them in the compost bin, you can put them around the compost, and often they'll just drop that population really quickly, and it just helps you get on top of the issue much faster than you might otherwise. Okay, so assuming you've got through all of that lovely balanced compost, when is it ready to use? Well, I guess the answer is when it looks like nice dark chocolate cake. And here's a sample that I took to that composting workshop to show everyone. So it'll smell pleasantly earthy. It won't smell kind of funky or foul. It will have cooled down if it was in fact warm or hot. When it's very mature, it will have come back to normal sort of outdoor temperature. But having said that, you can use immature compost. So if it is still a bit warm, it actually doesn't really matter, as long as it's not right up against young seedlings or seeds. So remember, you can actually just bury food scraps. That's called trench composting. As long as you bury them nice and deep, so no animals are going to get to them and dig them up. So if you can bury fresh food scraps, you can certainly bury mostly composted scraps. But yeah, again, just put them somewhere where the mature plant will find them, but it gives them a few extra weeks to break down. And here you can see there's a few bits of leaf that just haven't quite broken down. They probably ran out of nitrogen to get processed. And if I left them a long time, they would break down. So causing no harm at all. And you will find things like eggshells, avocado skins, avocado pips, you know, the odd staple if you're putting in some newspapers sometimes and things. So none of that is a problem. It's just a cosmetic thing that you need to come to terms with. Okay. Oh, and sorry, in terms of time frame, most home composts are fully mature in about 3 to 6 months. They could take up to a year, depending on what ratio of carbon and nitrogen you popped in them though. So it does take a long time. Warmer composts and like a hot compost can be mature in 4 weeks, and it can look like it's mature, but it's still quite hot in about 2 weeks. So yeah, those big piles and lots of nitrogen in them really do speed the process up. For those of you who are not patient, making sure you've got enough nitrogen sources in there is important without overwhelming it. And also if you have smaller pieces of everything, so people are chopping up their garden waste a bit and ripping up paper and things, just having more smaller pieces and more surface area helps the microbes process them more quickly. So it's a question of how patient you are, how much work you want to put in. So I don't tend to do any of that, but I know some people who like faster and more consistent compost will put some extra effort in to do that. Yeah, some people noting that as well as avocado stones and things, they've also found teaspoons in their compost. Biros, veggie peelers, yep, me too. I think it's actually scandalous that they make green veggie peelers. They hide so easily in your scrap bucket. Yes, and Isabel saying any carbon, things like leaves, brown paper, cardboard, all torn up, toilet rolls, and yeah, definitely finding a faster turnaround when you rip it up. So that's good. Okay, so the last things I just want to say at the end, a bit of a recap, the most essential things for you to take away from today. And the first one is to put your compost pile somewhere that you'll use it, somewhere convenient, and make sure that you've got that supply of carbon materials next to it. And I'm really liking, someone said up before, Isabel's got a bin filled with carbon products to add right next to her compost bin. So that is perfect, fantastic. So that's one of the most important things, and make it really convenient for you to be always adding those. Start every pile with a layer of carbon. And when you're adding materials, always put that layer of carbon on top to suppress smell. And remember, we're going to add most things in roughly a 10 centimetre layer. roughly equal volumes of the carbon and nitrogen. But if you do have something that's really rich, like poultry manure or sawdust, you're going to put them on in much thinner layers, around 3 centimetres-ish. Every now and then, every few weeks, whenever you remember, check the moisture. Just make sure that it's not drying out or sodden if it's exposed to rain, and fluff it up. No need to do any turning, like big turning, unless you want to. Just get that compost screw or the garden fork and just fluff it. And remember that carbon materials that are quite fluffy, all the kind of leaves and, you know, toilet rolls and things you're adding, they can kind of put that air into the pile as well, just by being a bit fluffy. So that's also a good side benefit. You may need to adjust the balance, and that will become as simple as correcting your balance on a bike once you get a feel for it. And finally, you'll have great compost in about 6 months. And if you can make great compost, you can also grow great food. So that's my official kind of ending, and I'll end just by showing you some friends of mine, Rabia and Steve, and the veggies that they grow in upcycled pots, just by knowing how to do amazing compost. So I hope that that's been a really good introduction for you all. And we've got a little bit of time now before 8 o'clock to go through any questions, things you'd like me to repeat or clarify, any tips that you want to share with the group, and any other advice relating to composting that you need. So I might ask Beck to come back, Beck, and help me to go through this part.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. That was really great. I've got a question from Simone. Any advice for stone fruit pits?
Oh, sure. Yeah, they're not harmful in any way in your compost, but they're also, once again, they're not going to break down for you in a typical compost time frame. But you may actually get things like nectarines popping up in your compost if you let it sit around for a while. And if you do, they have quite a good track record of being great, very productive trees, and also what we call true to type, or similar to the fruit that you would have eaten. So you can transplant any that do pop up as trees gently. But yeah, if they bother you not breaking down, then I'd just chuck them under a fruit tree personally, or bury them if that bothers you as well. And I can see Annette said, Simone, I bash them with a hammer and use them as mulch. So yeah, that'll definitely work. I just skip the hammer bit and just chuck them under a tree.
Kat, I had a question as well. So particularly like during spring, when we've got a lot of rain, it's starting to warm up and the grass is really growing a lot, and trying to find enough carbon to kind of match how much green grass we're having. Any tips for that? I don't know.
Yeah, sure do. Well, first tip is take off the catcher from your lawnmower and just let the clippings just stay on the lawn, so that you'll see them obviously for a couple of days, but then they'll just break down and compost in situ. And I must say, I only compost or stick in my worm farms the absolute essentials, which for me is my kitchen scrap bucket. I tend to do most of my composting in situ, which is just chopping and dropping and just leaving things under the fruit tree where I've pruned, or I don't have a lawn, but if I did, just leave the clippings on the lawn. And that way you minimise effort and you minimise the space you need to compost and the work you need to put into balancing it. But if that doesn't appeal, then of course grass clippings are great in compost. So yeah, if we're having trouble finding carbon materials, then yeah, I do suggest just asking around to try and find things like wood shavings that you can sometimes get in big bags, and that are really concentrated. Getting out there and harvesting some of those autumn leaves.
Yeah, definitely. That's on the to-do list.
Like that's a really easy way, as long as you can store them. You've got somewhere that you can put them. And also obviously things like newspapers, cardboard, which I know newspapers are a dying product in physical form, but cardboard with all the packages that people are getting, cardboard's not going anywhere, so that might be another good urban source for you.
Yes, definitely. Michael's got a question. Are coffee grounds more nitrogen or carbon?
Yeah, they are technically in the nitrogen, but not by much is the answer. Yeah, so they're not they're sort of middle of the range, Michael, leaning into the nitrogen range. They are annoying to compost if you've got a lot of them, by the way. So they tend to do all right as like a small component of a compost pile, up to around sort of 10 or 20% or so. But yeah, because I was working on that hospitality composting project, and we had like 50% compost grounds for some of our hubs coming from cafes, and it really was quite difficult to sort of balance it. And also they've been through this steam process in an espresso machine. They've been kind of pasteurized, really, so it took a long time for life to get back to eating them, and for worms to be interested in them, because worms actually feed on bacteria and fungi, not actually on the food that we put in. So it took a long time for worms to be interested in eating them. Bit of a side note, sorry. Yeah, what else, Beck?
Just a couple of comments. Michael's also saying we're making biochar, which sounds pretty cool.
Oh, great. Yep.
Isabel's just said, I also sift my compost to use in making seedling mix.
Yeah, sure. Yep. We're obviously not talking about propagation tonight, but one of my top tips for people who are growing their own seedlings at home is to add compost to any potting mix or any seed raising mix that you've got, to add nutrients and add water holding capacity. Yeah, it is a nice thing to sieve it, because it's hard filling up punnets when there's any chunks in there. So yeah, it sounds good.
And Hero's got a question about bokashi. Found some grey mold in the bokashi. What did I do wrong? Are they still okay to use in the garden?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so sorry, we haven't really covered bokashi composting at all tonight. So I just went deep into the traditional compost. But yeah, you can get other organisms take over. And traditionally, like in my experience, the bokashi fungi that grows is white. So you've identified that with grey mold, there's something else going on there. I wonder if it smells really bad. Sometimes that's another indicator that something's gone wrong. So yeah, what did you do wrong? There could be not enough bokashi grain added. The bokashi grain could be old, or it could have been stored badly, so it's lost its effectiveness and something else, another type of fungus, has taken over. There could be something that went into the bucket that disrupted the other preferable fungus, or that seeded this other type of fungus. The desirable fungus has been knocked out of contention, it sounds like. So is it still okay to use for the garden? I'd say most likely yes, because you're going to be burying it anyway deeply, or composting it, so it's not directly being added around a plant. So I'd still be pretty comfortable burying that, even if it smells pretty bad. And yeah, just check your bokashi is still effective and hasn't been sitting around for too long. See if you can have a better result with the next bucket.
Michael's got a comment as well, which we haven't sort of touched on yet, is char from like charcoal from like a little fire pit or something like that. How is that okay to put in?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Michael, do you want to, it's silly for me to talk about it when you're here. Do you want to give people some tips on that?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, go for it.
So we've been experimenting with making biochar, and all the solutions seemed really expensive until one of the local professional biochar guys told me about a thing called a something pit. The guys that crossed the ocean on a raft, and it's basically just Kontiki kiln, it's called, thanks to my wife there. So we just dug a triangular, conical hole, roughly 3/4 of a metre wide and 3/4 of a metre deep. And it's the greatest fun. So we just save all the cuttings on our property from trees and branches, or anything that's too thick to go in the compost. You just start a small fire in the bottom, and as each layer catches, you just build it up with another layer. So the flame front acts as an oxygen barrier and stops the rest of the stuff decomposing into just ash. And you just build this pit up. I always joke it takes quite a bit of white wine and sourdough bread and cheese to do this, because you sit around all evening just stoking it gently. You end up with the loveliest glowing pit of coals. You pour water on it at the end of the night, and just fill the pit with water. Next day you come out and shovel it out and crush it whatever way you can. We've done everything from Kay walking up and down with her gumboots on the footpath, to now we've got a lawn roller, and we just roll it, and it makes the most perfect char. So the charcoal, crushed charcoal is the first thing, and this is to do with re-establishing carbon in the soil and sequestering this carbon stays stable for hundreds of years, and the nanotubes in it act as an excellent center for beneficial microbes, and they store water, and it's restoring some of the carbon that, since white people come to Australia, has sort of reduced it from 5 or 10% to 2% or something. But the other aspect of it is the biochar, and there's the bio part of it. If you just stick the carbon straight on, initially it will spend the first year sort of charging itself up and extracting nutrients. So you can stick it in tubs, buckets, anything, with some Charlie carp, sea salt, and as much urine. You can piss in the buckets as much as you like, and let them steep for a month or so. Or you can just sprinkle it into your compost, because it's just pure carbon. And it's the best way to charge it up and to keep your compost nice and healthy. And it's like everyone talks about carbon filters and stuff, and that biochar is just brilliant for our garden. We found it's really, really obvious how much it helps.
Thanks for sharing that, Michael.
Yeah, and it's a permaculture principle of recycling everything on the property.
Sure. Yep. And it's obviously it's good if you've got a larger block, especially like burning off and things in the back garden. But yeah, definitely one to keep in mind. And yeah, if you do have a fire and there are charcoal pieces left at the end of the night, they can definitely go in the compost as well. So it's a nice reminder.
If you could ever get an old washing machine tub or anything like that, like people use for fires, that would do it just as well.
Yep, absolutely. Yep. So yeah, there's another option there. And of course, if you do generate things like wood ash as well, obviously from clean, what I call clean wood, in the sense of not painted, varnished, etc., that is also really, really nutrient rich and can go in the compost. And it's often better to put it through the compost because it's so alkaline that it can change your soil pH, and that may or may not be a good thing, but very rich in nutrient as well, and good to go in the compost system as well.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Heroes responded saying there was no bad smell with the bokashi, and thank you, Kat.
Lovely. Oh, better luck next time, Hero. All right, well, yeah, we're right on 8, so I might hand back to you, Beck, if there's anything you want to say at the end. But I hope that's been a good overview, and given you the basics, and allowed you to identify things to try, or things that might have been going wrong, or anything that you want to do differently next time. So thanks again, and all the best.
Thank you so much, Kat, and thanks everyone for coming along. Have a good night.
See you, folks.